The Final Reckoning isn't just the 8th and sort of maybe final Mission Impossible. It's also the second half of a story that began in Dead Reckoning, which was originally called Dead Reckoning Part 1. Both movies pit super spy Ethan Hunt against the Entity, a malicious AI intent on controlling and eventually destroying the world. A villain that feels ripped from modern headlines, but the finale gets more interesting when you think of it as a conclusion to a different trilogy altogether, one about Tom Cruise saving cinema itself. As it happens, the first entry in that trilogy isn't even a Mission Impossible movie. It's Cruise's 36 years later sequel, Top Gun: Maverick. Together, the three action hits see Cruise's characters square off against automation and obsolescence, creating a hidden meta-story about the man himself, as the last true Hollywood movie star. To get to the origins of this trilogy, we actually need to go a little further back to the beginning of Cruise's working relationship with Final Reckoning director Christopher McQuarrie, who co-wrote Maverick and helmed the last 4 Mission Impossible films. Actually, we need to go back just a little further back than that. Stick with me here. Since it began in 1996, the Spy series has been Cruise's baby. He was a producer as far back as the first film, and he was also responsible for choosing a number of its directors. For its first 4 entries, each movie had a radically different style, with a new filmmaker leaving their mark on the franchise. But with the 4th movie, Ghost Protocol, things started to move in a different direction. Not only did the marketing start to focus on Cruise's death-defying stunts, but this was where Cruise brought on the usual suspects and Valkyrie scribe, McQuarrie, to rewrite the movie's screenplay after filming was underway. McQuarrie is one of Hollywood's go-to script doctors, having done uncredited work on everything from X-Men to Rogue One. This theme of problem-solving on the fly works itself into McQuarrie's Mission Impossible films in a number of ways. His and Cruise's filming style is all about improvising in the face of challenges, which has always been a part of the spy genre. But in Ghost Protocol, and especially in the first McQuarrie-helmed movie Rogue Nation, the story is all about Hunt and his team responding to problems with quick new solutions as technology constantly fails them, and their plans go off the rails, often in comedic ways. Whether through ingenuity or dumb luck, Hunt always finds his way out of tough situations, and by the time Mission Impossible Fallout comes around, the spy stuff as metaphor for filmmaking becomes even more explicit, in the form of Henry Cavill's Agent Walker trying to take shortcuts to do things the easy way. Hunt may be improvising at all times, but there's a method to his madness, just like the way he and McQuarrie try to ensure that no matter where their ideas come from, or at what stage of production they arrive, they always retain a human element, by executing everything in practical fashion, even if it means Cruise breaking his ankle while trying to soar through the air. And speaking of flying, Cruise would take practical training to a whole new level in the film that kicked off this makeshift trilogy. Top Gun: Maverick was already in the can by the time the world stopped in 2020 and the pandemic forced theaters to shut down. So, by the time the movie finally opened in 2022, it arrived with an added layer of nostalgia, not just for Top Gun, but for movies themselves. Specifically for old-school big-screen spectacle rooted in practical, tangible effects. For the production, Cruise insisted on putting his younger co-stars through an Air Force boot camp, to the point that it affected their health.
Well, Tom, it turns out I have jet fuel in my blood. And without even skipping a beat, Tom just goes, "Yeah, I was born with it, kid."
But the result was filmmaking magic, since every scene in the air was shot inside the actual cockpit of a working fighter plane, making you feel like you're part of the action. This approach to stunt work wasn't new for Cruise, but what was new was the borderline explicit admission of what this approach was all about. The story of Maverick is about a veteran pilot returning to teach a new generation the ropes, much like in real life. Only where most legacy sequels are about returning characters passing the torch, Cruise's Maverick has to show everyone how it's done, or that it can be done in the first place. The mission, should they choose to accept it, involves precise timing, coordination, and trust between several pairs of pilots and wingmen, not unlike Cruise and the directors he handpicks for many of his projects. Right from the movie's opening scenes, Maverick is fighting against the tide of change, not out of stubbornness, but out of a genuine belief that sometimes the old ways are just better. In an age where Hollywood executives keep cutting corners and making decisions so late in the game that you can't even make choices on set, the opening scene of Maverick going rogue and pushing back against an unmanned drone program is especially poignant.
These planes you've been testing, Captain, One day, sooner than later, they won't need pilots at all.
The future is coming, and you're not in it.
The men in suits want to cut Maverick's funding, but he's out to prove that a real, flesh and blood human being is always going to give you better results. Which brings us to... In Dead Reckoning Part 1, technology doesn't just fail people, it actively manipulates them into bringing about their own demise.
A ghost in a machine.
Eventually revealed to be a US government software that went off the rails, the entity is intent on worming its way into everyone's personal and political secrets, forcing them to turn to analog technology. When the film was being shot in 2020, the fear of rampant AI wasn't on everyone's minds just yet, but its story grew out of an era of political mistrust and fake news online. So, it was only a matter of time before the tech became advanced enough to manipulate reality itself. This warping of reality leaves Hunt and his team vulnerable to attack, not just physically, but emotionally. The only people they can trust are each other, and even then, only face to face.
I know what matters most to you, Ethan.
This is a bad shame.
No, it's not. But you are done.
It's a movie that brings the spy genre's paranoia to a whole new level, and the only way to battle the entity is, well, Looney Tunes style action. It's not the most elegant solution from a story standpoint, since Cruise and McQuarrie like to work in reverse, thinking of the ideas for their stunts first and building a story around them.
I wanted to do it since I was a little kid.
But the human element of what they do is so powerful and overwhelming that the sheer spectacle of their stunts is enough to sell people on their work. When you see a major action set piece in a Mission Impossible movie, part of the thrill is the sense of danger stemming from the fact that it's happening for real. It harkens back to earlier eras of cinema, where stuntmen from Buster Keaton to Jackie Chan became the stars. Of course, CGI has its own place as a storytelling tool capable of pushing boundaries, but there's a difference between augmenting practical stunt work with visual effects and replacing human artists altogether. And hey, maybe Cruise's return to tradition will have a long-term impact on some of the original culprits. In Dead Reckoning, the entity targets Ethan because he's the only person capable of stopping it, which feels like a not-so-subtle metaphor for Cruise taking on the era of streaming algorithms all by himself. When asked if he ever considered debuting Top Gun Maverick on streaming, he responded, "No, that's not going to happen ever." Anytime there's a big film or two in theaters, Cruise takes it upon himself to do some DIY promotion. In case you hadn't heard, the guy loves movies. So it's no surprise that the subtext of Dead Reckoning and The Final Reckoning involves Cruise fighting to free the world from a software trying to run their lives, and his solution is the biggest and craziest possible stunts on the silver screen. Of course, like any human form of artistry, Cruise and McQuarrie's style of production has its limits. And the first hour of The Final Reckoning turns the nostalgia for practical filmmaking into nostalgia for the series itself through excessive flashbacks. Their improvised filmmaking style hits a bit of a wall as well, resulting in some disorienting use of space. It's frenetic, but, maybe too frenetic. However, when it comes time for Cruise to kick things into high gear, he makes a plea not just to characters in the film, but to the audience as well.
I need you to trust me. One last time.
Cruise basically risks his neck to bring the movie's second half back on track with some wildly intense moments, all centered around real danger. Whether a rotating submarine set or Hunt hanging off a biplane that echoes some of the earliest aerial stunts in all of cinema. Whether he's in front of the camera or behind it, and whether he's inside the cockpit or hanging out of it, for Cruise, it's not just about standing out, but about learning from the history and artistry of stunt filmmaking to create something new.
There's stunt people that do this, and I would study them and learn those things, and kind of how can I evolve action and storytelling and imbue kind of that kind of story with greater amount of motion and develop that stuff, and that's what happened.
Whether or not we get more movies like these from him ever again, one thing's for certain. When it comes to pushing the envelope of Hollywood action and changing the way we think about stunts as their own kind of storytelling, mission accomplished.
The end is inevitable, Maverick. Your kind is headed for extinction.
Maybe so, sir. But not today.